welcome. My name is Brendan Sheen. I want to welcome you to the 22nd floor to our speakers series. Our guest today has been described by his colleague Russ Mitchell as being on the Mount Rushmore's Cleveland journalists. And from talking and knowing Mr. Bibb for all these years, I agree with Russ Mitchell on that. Since 1979, Leob Bibb has been a large part of our Cleveland community as one of our top news anchors and journalists. What you may not know about Mr. Leob Bibb is that he's a graduate of the Glenville High School and Bowling Green, which Judge over here, Conley, is alum, and they met over there at Bowling Green. But he's also a Bronze Star recipient for service under fire in Vietnam. And believe this, he was the first and second African-American journalist to anchor a prime-time newscast in Ohio. A 6-time Emmy winner and member of the Broadcasters Hall of Fame, Mr. Bibb has agreed to come here and speak to us, and he's interviewed numerous political leaders and notable figures, including President Barack Obama, President George H.W. Bush, Neil Armstrong, amongst others. But today he's going to discuss his interview with James Earl Ray, the convicted assassin of Dr. Martin Luther King. So could we all welcome, at Cleveland, Cuyahoga County, welcome to the famous anchor newsman, Leob Bibb.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. And I think you're going to find some very interesting things today. We're going to get to this in just a minute about the James Earl Ray interview and how I got it. And but I'm just glad to be here. My wife Marguerite is here. We want to welcome Marguerite. She and I have been holding hands since we were freshmen at Bowling Green. Wow. And Ellen was back there with us too. I wasn't holding hands with Ellen. But we were very good friends back there. But before I get into the James Earl Ray part, I want to set the stage for you. And everything I say is going to be tied together. It may not make sense at the beginning, but believe me, it all comes together before we get out of here. Let me say that we knew that when I was in college in the 1960s, we knew that we were in a changing landscape. It was palpable. You could actually touch the landscape. We knew that things were changing around us. We were college students at Bowling Green State University in Northwest Ohio. My friend C. Ellen Connolly, as I said, was there. We knew each other. Also, there was a roommate of mine and a fraternity brother, Ralph Kennedy. We were followers of Martin Luther King. We've been followers of President John F. Kennedy. Like our parents, we had photographs of President Kennedy and Martin Luther King on the wall. My parents had that on their home. I have a photograph of Martin Luther King right now at our home. But we were in love with the Kennedy mystique. Although Kennedy was slow in coming around to some of the civil rights movement, we still appreciated when he did come around and worked with Martin Luther King on some things. We were followers of Martin King, and some of us were followers of Malcolm X. But the landscape was in a state of change in the early 1960s and the mid-1960s. King was assassinated. Kennedy was assassinated. Malcolm X was assassinated. And Bobby Kennedy assassinated. All of this between 1963 and 1968. The world was in upheaval. Everything was changing. My good friend and I, Ralph and I, often spoke. Ralph was a member of the track team at Bowling Green State University. He was a quarter miler. He could run the quarter mile in about 48.7 seconds. He was the #2 man on the mile relay. We were integration-minded, Ralph and I. We talked about integration. We talked about how we loved Martin Luther King from 1962 to 1966, the years that we were in school. But as I said, the landscape was changing. After graduation, Ralph and I went our separate ways. I ended up in the Army. Ralph ended up in Cincinnati. I received a letter from him, and I've got that letter with me, on how his life had changed. A year later, I found out I was in the war in Vietnam. That was when Martin Luther King was murdered. I was in Vietnam. And when we read about it, I says, what in the heck is going on back home? They say it's crazy over here in Vietnam. It's crazy back home. Martin Luther King has been assassinated in April of 1968. While I was in Vietnam, Ralph got in trouble. Convicted of the murder of a police officer in Nashville, Tennessee, Ralph was in prison for 99 years. What happened to Ralph? We'll talk about that in a bit. Then in 1974, while I was working at the NBC TV station in Columbus, I received a phone call from the FBI. Agent told me on the phone, 1974, you're a friend of Ralph Kennedy, aren't you? I says, yes, Ralph and I. He said, you were his roommate, weren't you, at the fraternity house back at Bowling Green? I says, yes, that's true. When was the last time you saw Ralph? I said, June 6, 1966. How can you be so exact of the date? Graduation date. It's on my degree. He said, Ralph has escaped from prison. I'd heard that. He said, well, if he contacts you, you let us know. And I remember my exact words. I'll keep that in mind. We'll get back to that. Now enter James Earl Ray into our story, in prison for the '68 assassination of Martin Luther King. In 1978, an interesting man came to me asking if I would like to interview James Earl Ray about the assassination of Dr. King. This man was a Columbus, Ohio resident. I was working in Columbus Television then, and he had a notorious lifestyle. Larry Flynt, owner of Hustler magazine, that sexually explicit magazine which was pushing all of the boundaries. Flynt was in constant trouble because of the magazine. He was in constant court all of the time. He lived in Columbus, so we were always covering him. The news media always covering whatever is happening at that time. Larry Flynt used to come to the television station and just hang out there. So we would always interview him because he was always in trouble and he was always looking for, I guess, a little publicity to talk about what the courts were doing to him. He believed Ray was not guilty. And he had a magazine, another magazine, and a newspaper on the West Coast, which was pushing that idea. James Earl Ray is innocent of the murder of Martin Luther King. Leon, how would you like to interview James Earl Ray? I can get you in. I know James, and I'm going to interview him for my magazine. I'm friends with Jay. I don't know if he used the word friends, but I'm associated with James Earl Ray. And if you go down with me, we can interview James Earl Ray. I jumped at the idea. My television station jumped at the idea because it wasn't going to cost us anything. We were going to fly down on Flynt's long jet plane. We were not going to stay overnight, but we were just going to fly down there, interview Ray, and come back. I said, well, I can do a story on this local man, Larry Flynt, and I can do a story on what he thinks about James Earl Ray, and I can get an interview with James Earl Ray at the same time. Won't cost the company any money. The company jumped at that. This was 2 weeks before Larry Flynt was shot and paralyzed for life. That was in Georgia. 2 weeks before that, I'm running around with him in Tennessee. We fly down to Tennessee. I wanted to paint a picture of those times. We can run the tape now. This interview is from 1978.
It is here that James Earl Ray spends his days. He is the convicted killer of Dr. Martin Luther King. But Ray has maintained all along that he is innocent, and he says if he is to get a new trial, it will be this year. Flynt invited us to go with him to interview Ray at the Brushy Mountain Prison in eastern Tennessee. What he wanted was for us to interview Ray along with him. We were interested in that and the relationship between Ray, Flynt, and Ray's lawyer, Mark Lane. Brushy Mountain Prison is an ugly and depressing place. In June 1977, James Earl Ray escaped, running up the hills that surround the yellow-colored prison buildings, and got lost in the thick eastern Tennessee foliage. But the manhunt proved too much for the 49-year-old man with quiet eyes and the seemingly untrusting and questioning demeanor. Ray was apprehended a short while later. Some questions Ray answers quickly and to the point.
You couldn't do an interview like this unless somebody asked you, did you kill Dr. King?
No.
Who killed him?
Well, I think the only way that could be determined would be in a criminal trial or possibly a civil trial.
Other questions he responds to more slowly and is not as definite in his answers, such as...
Are you a racist, James?
I don't think so.
Have you ever been?
I really don't know what a racist is. I've never taken advantage of anyone physically or financially of a different ethnic group.
But I mean, do you believe in white supremacy? I mean, do you feel that a white man is better than a black man, or do you believe in racial equality?
No, I don't know too much about that subject. I don't think personally that I'm, superior to someone else. Possibly in some respects I would be somewhat inferior.
Do you hate anyone because of the color of their skin?
No, I wouldn't say that, no.
Sitting quietly in the back of the room during the interview was Ray's lawyer, Mark Lane, who has written a book on the assassination of Dr. King and who is involved with an organization committed to urging Congress to investigate the King and Kennedy murders. Lane was also a vocal critic of the Warren Commission and conducted his own investigation of the John Kennedy assassination. But now Lane is also linked with Flynt. Flynt has hired him as senior executive editor of the Los Angeles Free Press Special Reports publication. That publication will cover the King assassination, with Lane as an executive of the publication and James Earl Ray's lawyer at the same time. Now back to Ray. Only if Ray approves can a reporter interview him, and Lane and Flynt, wanting coverage, got us into Brushy Mountain Prison. Lane said Ray would say something that he had never been said before, not in a legal proceeding or any interview, including the famous Playboy magazine interview. It was about Raoul, the man Ray says hired him to smuggle guns to Memphis, where Dr. King was slain. One of those guns was the rifle that killed Dr. King. Ray says he was to take the rifle to a certain boarding house. It was from there the shot came that killed King. Authorities say Ray's fingerprints were on the weapon. When Ray was caught, he admitted guilt, but now he says he was coerced into that, maintaining his innocence. Ray says at the time of the shooting he was at a service station getting a tire repaired. The implication, he was framed, probably by Raoul. Ray says he does not know Raoul by any other name, just Raoul. The new information Ray gives is he has seen a photograph of a man he believes is Raoul.
Now, how long did you work with Raoul in this gun smuggling business?
From approximately August 1967 till March 1968.
And you never referred to him by a last name? He never told you, and you never asked?
No, and I never...
Did he know your last name?
Well, he probably did, but he knew the wrong name.
Which name were you going by then?
When I first met him, I was going under the name of John Raines. He didn't know that, and later on I was using the name Eric Galt. But I think it'd be fairly easy to identify him because in the last 3 or 4 months I have made a positive identification through pictures. Mm-hmm. And
you think you could identify him?
Yes.
Have you seen the picture?
Yes.
What was the name under the picture?
Well, there was no name on the picture, but I think we can now make a positive identification if there is a trial.
Is it a name that I might know? Would I know Raoul?
No, I don't know. I haven't made any investigations on who the individual is or anything, because a lot of these people have 3 or 4 different names anyway, so you can never.
Ray won't say who showed him the photograph or any more on the subject of Raoul. This was the only so-called new information to come out of the interview, but Flynt says he believes Ray can get a new trial. Flynt sees the FBI or the CIA or both as knowing more about this case than they have said. Flynt will not say that definitely that they were involved, but he leaves that door open. This entire event seemed to be a media event. Ray gave a tidbit of new information, but then slammed the door. Flynt then said the national press was controlled by the government, so he wanted local media to tell the story.
There's a lot more to it, but it's about Larry Flynt, and we can get into that if we get some questions and all of that. But What was interesting was he just said he didn't do it. People asked me, well, do I believe him? Well, he first said he did do it when he was arrested 31 days after Dr. King was killed. James Earl Ray was on the run. He was traveling with 2 different passports, 2 different names on it. And he went through Canada from Memphis, then went to London, England, and he was apprehended at Heathrow Airport in London. That's where he said that he killed Dr. King to keep from getting the death penalty, I'm assuming. I'll let the attorneys, they can speak to that better. But then afterward, he said he did not do it. I've talked to Louis Stokes, former the late Congressman Louis Stokes, and Louis interviewed James Earl Ray later on when they had the re-examination on the MLK and the JFK assassinations for Congress. And Congressman Louis Stokes and I used to get together and talk about our interviews with James Earl Ray and kind of compare notes. And Louis Stokes says, oh, he was a liar. He was the biggest liar you've ever seen. And I kind of got that. I got that opinion as well. But back to our story. When I went in and set up our cameras for the interview with James Earl Ray, we set up in a special room that they had, a holding cell. They brought James Earl Ray in, and he walked in and he looked at me and he says, are you the man who's going to interview me? I says, yes, I am. He says, how you doing? I'm James Earl Ray. So now I got to make a decision now. I got to make a decision. And the decision I made was, well, he does not have to do the interview with anybody. So I shook his hand. Now what do I say? I didn't say, well, it's good to meet you. I just said, I'm Leob Bibb. Why don't you sit right here? We'll put a microphone on you right there. And that's how we began. Back to my story. Ralph Kennedy. Ralph was at Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary for the murder of those 2 police officers. We can get deeper into that. I believe Ralph was very much innocent of that, was not guilty of that. And Ralph got mixed up with a bunch of guys. They were called black revolutionaries, for lack of another phrase, but that's how they were labeled, down in Nashville, Tennessee. They were involved with stolen money orders. 5 men in a car. A police officer stops them, I think, for a traffic violation down a one-way alley, something like that. The man in the front seat gets out with a rifle and kills both police officers. Everybody scatters. This is 1968. Remember the times now. That's key to what I'm talking about. Everybody scatters. Ralph runs back to Cincinnati, his home. Ralph goes to the police station and says, they're looking for me down in Nashville, Tennessee. I was there when the 2 cops got killed. I didn't do it, but I'm surrendering because I don't want this on me. I want to let you know what happened. The gunmen, they all scattered. The gunmen went elsewhere. They put Ralph in the jail cell. And then they send him to Tennessee, where he stands trial. He's given 99 years in prison. He is sentenced to Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary, where James Earl Ray is. Eventually, Ralph will be transferred to another prison in the Tennessee prison system. 1974, Ralph escapes from that prison, just as James Earl Ray had escaped from Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary, and he was on the run for maybe a day or a couple of days or so. They brought him back. Ralph escapes from the second prison. Ralph is on the run for 12 years, till 1986. But I'm interviewing James Earl Ray in 78, while Ralph is still running. So now, James Earl Ray and I start talking about a man we both know. Talk about a small world. My fraternity brother, not that James Earl Ray and Ralph were friends. They would not have been friends. I asked James off camera, where do you think Ralph is? Ray says, out of the country. if he's smart. Ralph Ray was out of the country when he was caught for the murder of Martin Luther King. Eventually, in 1986, Ralph is found under the name of Charles Meadows, living in Baltimore, Maryland. He's got a kind of a low-level job, college graduate, low-level job, under the radar, marijuana possession, something with marijuana, arrested, fingerprinted, computer kicks the fingerprints out. This is the man who escaped prison, who had served in the same prison with James Earl Ray that we talked about, and then transferred to another prison. This is the man who escaped prison and was on the run for all those years. They put him in the jail cell. And my fraternity brother, and very good friend, I have his photograph with me, is found hanged to death in his jail cell. It is a suicide. They rule. A story that began at the beginning of college, going all the way to 1986, when Ralph is caught. James Earl Ray, Larry Flynt, all of this swirling around me. Eventually, the gunman and the other people who were involved in the murder of the police officer, they were eventually found in a shootout in Florida, and one of them surrendered, and the other one was killed by FBI agents. What can I tell you? What can I tell you about my life? It's a photograph of Martin Luther King right there from the Cleveland Call and Post when Dr. King was in Cleveland. I took the photograph. I interned with the Cleveland Call and Post in 1965. I've been doing this a long time. This is all I've ever wanted to do, was be a journalist. That's my photograph. So I was with Dr. King in 1965. I've been with Coretta Scott King, interviewed her, had dinner with her in a special program just a few years ago. I've interviewed Martin Luther King III, the son of Dr. Martin Luther King, and I've interviewed the assassin of Martin Luther King, and all of that as a local reporter. This is a photograph of our fraternity at that time, in the early 1960s, and that's Ralph on the far left. Ralph on the far left. I'll keep this up. That's Ralph on the far left, my good friend, who I think was there, but I don't think was involved in the murder of those two cops. By the way, I'm told that Ralph walked out of prison in a woman's dress. There was some sort of a tour going on, some people visiting, and the word on the street is that somebody walked in wearing two dresses, and two women walked out. That's the word, but he was found in a woman's clothing walking out of that prison. That's the word. And I've got a long letter which I'll not read, but this is how I know where Ralph's head was. This letter is from 1967, when I was in the Army, and Ralph wrote me a long letter, a 6-page letter, telling me how he had changed and where his head was and the things that he believed he didn't believe anymore. This was a guy who was a college graduate. This was a guy who joined the Presbyterian Church in Bowling Green, Ohio, was the only black member to join the Presbyterian Church there in Bowling Green. This was a guy who was in love with Martin Luther King. This was a guy who was an integrationist. This is a guy who was on the track team and ran the quarter mile. This was a lovable man. Ellen knew him. My wife Marguerite knew him. We all knew him. And something happened in those turbulent 1960s. And this is just a story of, I can't say whether who was right, who was wrong. I'm not getting into that, but I can only tell you all of this swirls around me. And that's why I call this story the pornographer, the sprinter, and the assassin, the backstory of the interview with James Earl Ray in 1978. And there's a lot more to it we can talk about if you got some questions, and I'll take your questions if you got. He just said he didn't do it. He wouldn't go into any detail about that. His lawyer was in the back of the room.
Another lie,
Hmm?
Another lie?
Probably. And Louis said when he interviewed him, when they brought him up to Congress to interview him, that he lied every turn of the way. I've got books that I've read about James Earl Ray and his whereabouts during these times of the King assassination. But he just said that he didn't do it, but he seemed nervous around me. But he just was fidgety, as I recall. It's been a long time, but he seemed just fidgety around me. And but Larry Flynt was insistent that he was innocent of it.
Mr. Bibb, did Ray ever indicate to you who he thought was behind this? Did he ever go beyond just saying there was some guy named Raoul who took weapons?
Yeah, he said, as I recall, he said he knew nothing of Dr. King, nothing of the King murder. He said he did not hold anything against Dr. King, that he did not feel this way or that way about civil rights. And I said, well, what were you doing in Memphis? He said, well, I was running guns with Raoul. And that's all that I could get out of it. I mean, and it's kind of like talking in circles. That's all that I could get out of it. And of course, now when I look at that piece, I would have done that piece totally different today. But I was just a kid. I was just a kid. That piece is what, 1978? Was that 41 years? Oh my God, where does the time go? 41 years ago. I was just a kid, just starting. So my journalism chops weren't where I hope they are today, where they are today. They weren't that good. So a lot of it, I was just a kid in awe of where I was and trying to control as much of the interview as I can, but allowing Larry Flynt to have some say, because Flynt got me in. And there's a backstory to that, to Flynt, and we'll get to that in a second if you want to hear that. Yes,
Well,
sir.
yeah, my question really actually is about Flynt, and why, a couple things. Why did he choose you, and why? And you said that he got shot 2 weeks later. What was your relationship with Flynt going forward after he was shot, if
Well,
any?
after we shot, I think we'd interviewed him a few more times. People at the station interviewed him because he lived in Columbus. We pushed this story up when he got shot. We had planned on holding that story for another month or another and working on it. But when he got shot, we had to push it up because Flynt, local man, was in the news. My relationship with Flynt remained much the same. I saw him a few years ago. He came by Channel 5 where I was working at the time. This may have been 10, 12 years ago. Why he was in town, I don't know, but he stopped by the TV station, did an interview with one of our other reporters. And as he was leaving, I was coming in, and then somebody said, yeah, Larry Flynt's out in the parking lot in his car, in his long limousine. He's still paralyzed. And I ran to the window and I said, James, Larry, you may not remember me. I remember you, Leon. You, me, and James Earl Ray. That's what I remember. Flynt was notorious. He was a notorious pornographer. He reveled in being a pornographer. That was his term. He says, Leon, you're a good reporter, and I'm a good pornographer. And that was always a quote. And he said, but he talked about freedom of the press, and he always said that if this nation will tolerate anything that I do and say, you know that your rights are guaranteed, that your rights are good. He said, because that's what freedom of the press talks about. So he would talk about stuff like that. On the way back from the, if you're interested in a little bit on Flynt, do a couple of minutes on that. On the way back to the airport from Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary, we're sitting in the back seat of his limousine. Like I said, I went along with Flynt because it didn't cost my station anything, and they were very cheap about it. So we're sitting in the back seat. My cameraman, Bruce Johansson, is back there, and we're rolling. We're kind of doing an interview with Larry Flynt about how everything is gone. It is, I think, the month of March, yeah, and the trees do not yet have a lot of full leaves on them yet. They're in that part of the mountains of Tennessee. The sun is low on the horizon. It's going down. It hadn't set yet, but it's low, and it's got that big orange ball that we celebrate, you know, close to sunset. It's coming in the side window, and Larry Flynt has reddish hair, red-brown hair, and the window was down a little bit, so his hair was kind of moving around. And the sun highlighted him, almost like a halo. Almost spiritual. Just looking. So we're rolling, the camera's rolling. Larry, what do you think about this? Well, Leon, I think we can get him another trial. I think he's innocent. I think somebody else did it, and I'm going to work to get him another trial. And he says, I got a lot of things that I want to do. He says, I really believe that I can get the Israelis and the Arabs together in the Middle East. I think that I could work a deal, and I can get them together. I think if they fly me to Russia and Soviet Union, I think I can help the United States in strategic talks with the Soviets. All this is going on. Now, I'm a reporter. You just put the microphone there, and all this stuff is just coming out of him. And I said, Larry, you seem like you can fix about just everything. He said, well, a lot of things. And something told me to ask this question, why I do not know. I says, Larry, are you the Messiah? Come again? And he gave it a long thought. He says, you know, sometimes I think I am. That kind of encapsulates the whole day. So I put that out. I put that out for you. I put that out for you. But that was my one time. Somebody else had a question up here? Yes, sir.
So, as a lifelong journalist, and you've had a lot of experiences, you've seen the events, you've met with different people. Is it challenging to stay objective?
Did what?
Is it challenging to stay objective?
No, that's just part of my job. People ask me all the time, you know, I'm open to all ideas. My job is just to interview people. I interview people, politicians I have voted for. I interview politicians I have not voted for. But they have a right to be heard. So I just try to be fair, straight down the line. And that's all I want to do. And I'm always just following the story.
So to follow up on that, what would you have done differently now if it were today interviewing James Earl Ray compared to that?
I probably would have, would have boned up more on it. I would have known a little bit more about the case. I mean, I've read books since then. I would have boned up more about that, and I would have challenged him a lot more on what were you doing in England, and why were you over there, and what were you running from, and I've since read a book. There's a walking out of your shot. I've read the book, and maybe some of you have seen that. Hellhound on his trail. This is the story of James Earl Ray, how he stalked Martin Luther King. It's an interesting read if you're interested in this. I try not to read it before I go to bed. It gives bad dreams, so I read it in the daytime, but I'm finished with it now. But I probably would have done it differently. When I look at that piece, it's like when you're a reporter, you get better as you know, I've got 48 years in television total, 40 in Cleveland alone. That was in my earliest days of television. So I think that I've gotten a lot better, you know, and certainly in telling the story. Yes, sir.
Was there any immediate effect on your career after doing this story?
No, it didn't adversely affect it. It probably helped me get to Cleveland. Channel 3 in those days, I came here in 1979, and Channel 3 called me when I was working in Columbus Television. When I did that, they called me and asked me if I'd like to come up here and work. And so we talked about it for about a year, and eventually made the trip up here and back to my hometown of Cleveland. So it helped my career. But I really wasn't doing that for the career. I was doing that just as an opportunity, to see where it was going. And I was very nervous about it. It was the first time I'd been in prison. And they really do lock the doors behind us. They locked us in there too, but we were able to get out. So it was the first time I had been, I think I'd been in Ohio State prison a couple of times before that. But it was an opportunity. And that's what I was looking for. Better question? Yes, sir.
Have you seen the Woody Harrelson movie about Larry Flynt? And if so, did it capture his essence?
Yeah, I saw some of it. And I think that was pretty much Flint. Flint is an unusual man, to say the least. I don't know where he lives now, but I do know that he's still wheelchair bound because of the bullet that he took in his back. I don't know if they ever found out who did it or not, but just a very interesting man. I mean, for what he did way back then with his magazine. I guess the magazine is still out. I don't know. I think there's a Hustler Club in Cleveland that might still be. I don't know. At last I saw there was one down in the Flats. I don't know if that's his or not, but there were Hustler Clubs around, and there was one in Columbus that I dropped in once. Doing some research. How I met? Oh yeah, I met Larry Flynt because one of our neighbors worked for Larry Flynt. He was like head of public relations for the magazine where Marguerite and I lived, and he invited us to a party. And I said, well, where do you work? He says, well, I work for Larry Flynt over at Hustler magazine. And I said, well, I'd like to meet him. And that's how I got a chance to meet Larry. And after that, Larry was always coming to the TV station. I think somebody asked if why he chose me.
Yeah.
He said that he had pitched this story to the network, and the networks didn't bite, is what he said. And so he came to me. And I kind of think he came to me thinking that maybe I would tell it his way, that James Earl Ray was not guilty, a black man saying that. And I just kind of went along. I just followed the story. I wasn't going to decide whether he did it or did not do it. I was just going to follow the story wherever the story took me. So I think that might have been one of the reasons that he selected me or asked me. And if I had said no, he probably would have asked somebody else.
Did you at the time have any recollections about or thoughts on Mark Lane, who obviously became one of the biggest porn commission critics too?
Mark Lane was involved in JFK.
He was probably one of the first and most vocal.
Yeah, I knew that, but I didn't know much about him. I didn't expect to see Mark Lane in the room when we got to the prison. I didn't expect to see him there. I thought it would just be Larry, James, and me. But I don't even think I probably did an interview with Lane. I probably did, but it's not on this piece here that I brought. Oh, yeah.
After he was shot, did he continue to try and prove Ray's innocence? Did he follow through on it?
He didn't. He went on to something else. He went on to something else. In fact, I don't think I ever got too much more out of Larry after we did the interview and after he was shot. Then we followed that story. But then he stayed in court. He was always in court down in Cincinnati, appeals court down there. He was always in court doing something down there, and it was just unsettling. The whole thing was to meet the man who killed Dr. King. He was involved in it. There's another person on the King assassination. I wish he were here today. He's a clergyman, lives in Cleveland. I don't know if you know this, Ellen, or not. He's a well-known clergyman. Lives in Cleveland, was the cab driver in 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee, who was dispatched to go pick up Dr. King from the Lorraine Motel and take him to dinner. And this cab driver, Bishop J. Delano Ellis of the Pentecostal Church at East 105th Street and Chester Avenue, was the cab driver in those days. He was a minister and moonlighting on the side as a cab driver. There's a black cab company, there's a white cab company. He worked for the black cab company. And they sent him to pick up Dr. King. And I've interviewed Bishop Ellis about this. What I'm saying is out there to public. He's talked about it. He pulls up that April day in the Lorraine Motel. He knows he's taking Dr. King. Dr. King has stepped out on the balcony, and Bishop Ellis, not a bishop at that time, but a young minister, J. Delano Ellis, cab driver, gets out of his car and puts water on his windshield. I got Dr. King. I'm taking Dr. King to dinner, and Dr. King's entourage. Jesse is there, Andy Young is there, Ralph Abernathy is there. I'm taking them to dinner. Cleaning and making the back seat is clear. I've got Dr. King. I've got the leader. I've got the Moses of our people going to dinner. That's when the shots ring out. He looks around, and Dr. King is fallen on that on that balcony. You've seen the photographs. Next thing he knows, cops are all around. Everybody is scurrying. Everybody's screaming. Next thing you know, cops are there quickly. They run in. They block him in. He's blocked in. His cab is blocked in. He said the cops start roughing him up, pushing him around. Look at what you've done. Look at what you've done, what your people have done. This is what J. Delano Ellis is telling me now. I should have brought that interview too. This is what you've done. Get out of here. Get out of here. And he says, you've got me boxed in with your cop cars. They move a cop car. Get out of here. He says he's driving around and he's just driving in a fog. He's just driving. Next thing you know, another police officer stops him, pulls him out of the car. He roughs him up because they've got his license number. Apparently they put this on the police radio or whatever. He's roughed up. The whole town of Memphis, the whole of the world is in a dither. What do? Dr. King has been killed, is what J. Delano Ellis is telling me. You were here, many of you were here. I was in Vietnam, so I can only go by what the reports were. Sometime later, Senator Bobby Kennedy wants to talk to everybody there. Bobby Kennedy talks to J. Delano Ellis about what you saw. Bobby Kennedy is investigating himself. 2 months later, Bobby is assassinated in California. J. Delano Ellis, local story, right here in town. Also in town here, as I'll just do as a sidebar, is one of the Secret Service agents for John F. Kennedy, who's working in this town, probably working today, retired, but still working on the job. I've interviewed him too about the JFK assassination. He was there. He's in all the photographs, he's in the films, all of that. A Cleveland story. A Cleveland story. Yeah.
Mr. Bibb, did the FBI contact you after you seem to be associated with two escapees?
They never contacted me again. They never contacted me again. But they knew when Ralph had escaped from prison. And this story may sound convoluted. I hope I was able to tell it good, well. When they called me, they knew about Ralph's background. They knew where he went to school. They knew who his roommates were. It was about 6 or 8 of us. We all lived in a fraternity house. And they knew who was there. And they knew that I was his roommate, or one of his roommates. And so, but it was just that one time they called me. And what was so surprising was when they asked, when was the last time you saw Ralph? And I said in 1974, June 6, 1966. Which was the last time, graduation day. So.
Some of you might know Don Williams. He would have been at the same time, right?
Who was
Corky Williams.
Corky was there. Donald Corky Williams, attorney here in town. He was there. He's one of our fraternity members. We all lived together. We all knew the story. We all knew the story of what happened to Ralph. And Ralph. Such a beautiful penmanship. This letter, 6 pages from written in ballpoint pen, not ballpoint, ink, wet ink. 6 pages, and he goes on talking about the things that he now believes, and this was in 1967, before he was arrested the first time in early 68, I think it was. I think it was right before the MLK assassination. But he talks a lot about where his mind was. So I wanted to kind of paint a picture, especially for the younger people here, of those turbulent times. The times where cities were in riots and blacks were we were trying to make inroads into what was going on, becoming more American. 10,000 students at Bowling Green State University, only 125 black. We knew each other. We're in that first wave of jobs opening. And some of us went this direction, some of us went that direction. And Ralph got involved in some things that he shouldn't have been involved in, stolen money orders, and got caught up in the murder of 2 police officers. And so I think about him a lot. And I thought about him when I interviewed James Earl Ray. It was kind of an afterthought. I mean, I hadn't planned on going there. I was just going to do the MLK, James Earl Ray thing. And then after the camera shut off, I asked him about Ralph. Where do you think he is? Out of this country, if he's smart. That's how it ended. Wow. Thanks.